Thank you, Tricia. Thanks, everyone. It's great to hear my name pronounced that way. I do get Ogier. Anyway, I'm another social scientist. I've been trying to think of the collective noun for social scientists. And I work at IMAS in Hobart. I wear a couple of hats, but one of them is to coordinate the FRDC's sub-program in human dimensions research, HDR. But the other hat I wear is I'm actually a fishwife, and my husband's a member of the Tasmanian commercial rock lobster fishery. So two sets of insights on these sets of issues. Now, I assume pressing the right thing. Yeah, we go. I wanted to kick off today because it's 5 years roughly since an event known as the super trawler, or the proposed introduction of the Magirus, came into Australian communities' consciousness, if you like. And it's a fantastic time to look back and think, not focus on the events themselves really, but where have we got in terms of understanding communities and consumers and tackling these issues of social licence and social acceptability. Because hats off to the industry and I include the management agencies in that, there's been considerable navel gazing and a lot of work in that time. So what emerged from that whole controversy was some really unlikely coalitions that were involved in the conflicts that emerged, including ENGOs and game fishers, some coalitions we'd not seen before. We saw a surprising level of use of social media deployed brilliantly, and a lot of the industry and other users of social media were playing catch up. We saw evidence of what surprisingly low levels of trust in what were typically viewed as the trusted source of information about the sustainability of a fishery or a proposal to change the fishery. And we saw a breadth of issues in the public arena that was also surprising. I mean, the debate centred around food security. It centred around, obviously, resource access and allocation, which is no surprise, but the focus on bycatch and the focus on scale, the industrial scale of what was going on, were new. And we saw rapid policy change, which was all part of the set of surprises. So these are when these sort of terms really came into our lingo and we started to talk about them. You can track it through the Seafood Directions program. We started to talk about the term social licence to operate. We really brought it to bear. And I'm going to use that term in relation to boats or farms or practices, because we've also started to talk about social acceptability, a term that Nikki Mazer and colleagues really put on our radar. And that's a different concept, but they're really related. And that's about fisheries and aquaculture as a whole, about management, about industry science and assessment, and about trust. But what happened as a result of the Magirus was a set of really big questions that emerged. What were the conflicts that drove this disruptive conflict? Because it was a very disruptive conflict. And how can we future-proof an industry against, if you like, fish wars in the future? We can't avoid conflict, but how can they be less disruptive, or how can we engage in them more constructively? And so in my job with FRDC, a question I wish I had a dollar for every time we were asked is, what's the solution? What's the engagement strategy? How do we gain our social licence? And there's no silver bullet answer. I'm not here to present that. But there's a series of really critical questions we need to ask, and I thought this is a great opportunity to go over what we currently now know about the various communities with an interest in fisheries and aquaculture and consumers, check in with that information as we consider how to continue our engagement. So questions are, what is our relationship to communities and consumers across fisheries and aquaculture? And if we're meant to build trustworthiness, which has been discussed many, many times already, what's the role of information versus the role of influence, and what's the responsibility of management and markets? So let's check in about communities and our state of knowledge about communities. So there's been a suite of research, really excellent research funded by FRDC, tackling this from a number of different directions. The main conclusion is the majority of the Australian population has a very low awareness of the industry, and their interest is very low. It's very low interest in these conflicts we're discussing. However, when prompted, there's a really high level of consensus that there's a focus on ecological sustainability for the fishery. That's the predominant value system that people, when they respond to issues about the acceptability of the industry, that's what they're responding on its ecological performance. and their view on the sustainability status of the fisheries and aquaculture is uncertain to moderate. So this is just summing up about 5 or 6 different reports in the last 5 years, which really do coalesce on a similar set of findings. The FRDC's tracking study of community perceptions is also finding not a significant level of change in these figures either. We've got about 40% that view the industry as sustainable, 40% that are unsure, and 20% that don't think it is. But who are these communities? And that's a really important question. So that first question is critical. What are their perceptions and attitudes? But secondly, who are they? And we know, as Nikki mentioned, there's a really big split, a skew between metro, regional and rural. And that's about presence and contact and visibility of the fisheries and aquaculture, I think. And there's a really significant skew that I don't think we should underestimate as to whether people, even before you ask them questions about fisheries and aquaculture, what their view of government is and regulation and management and their positions on its credibility, thanks. And then also a really important consideration is what stakes do those particular communities have? Are they recreational fishers? Are they divers? Are they in tourism industries? Are they indifferent? And then consumers, well, we've got all sorts of data just highlighting the cognitive dissonance, basically. It's a very technical term, but basically, time and time again, we know that consumers will give us stated preferences that they want local, they want sustainable, they want fresh, but what they do is that they buy the cheapest and the most convenient. We know they have perceptions about the negativity of imported fish, but we know that 70% of the seafood that we consume in Australia is imported. So there's a real disconnect going on here between intention and behaviour. We know we're eating less seafood than we know we should, but at least we know we should be eating more, which is a first step, and that supermarkets really are our major avenue of contact to consumers. However, these provenance-based producer-to-consumer models are really emerging and really starting to be noticed. Communities to consumers, I think we've got to be really careful to assume that the Australian consumer is the same thing as the Australian community that gets, or members of the community that get involved in these debates. It's a very select group that get involved in these conflicts, and that's different to the Australian consumer. They're telling us they're basically indifferent currently, but sections of the Australian community are clearly not indifferent. And so is an appeal to food values an effective strategy going forward for the seafood industry? We'd have to say mixed, given that how much of our seafood that we're consuming is imported. The vast majority of Australians have no form of direct link through consumption or living alongside any part of the fisheries and aquaculture industry. So we've got something to get over there. We really need to remember that we have to think about communities and consumers and not conflate the two. Right, information and influence. I think we've done a great job at providing some excellent information, but it's time to think about influence. The graphs here are pretty self-explanatory, but groups like the Four Corners report has significant influence on how much information was being distributed about the salmon industry compared to the Senate inquiry. And we've also got some interesting information that coming through from the EU that there are key stakeholders who are filtering some of the information that gets to political advisors, and that influence is not reflective of actual community general statements about their support or otherwise for the fisheries and aquaculture industry. So how that information used and by whom is becoming a really critical question. Management and markets, very briefly, but there is a role for management, of course, and it's being reflected as management agencies increase the breadth of what they're talking about. I'm about to come to my last slide. And the role of markets, well, food integrity and consumer trust models are emerging. We've got accreditation and we've got those provenance-based approaches. So where next? This is the new normal, I think. These considerations about community and consumers just has to be part of the landscape. But the conflicts are varied. What the conflicts are that are undermining social acceptability or social licence are not consistent. Therefore, the strategies will have to be varied. It's really important to understand how the industry is being judged, on what information and by who, and that we need these multiple level strategies for any success. There's no silver bullet. So thank you, everybody.